Thank you, Professor Muhammad Abdul Rahim and Professor Mahfuza Khanum, and to the Sufia Ahmed Memorial Trust Foundation for extending this invitation to me to have the inaugural, I hear it's the inaugural lecture of the lecture series. It is truly my honor to be here. I've had the good privilege of seeing Professor Sufia Ahmed, the late Professor Sufia Ahmed, from very close since my childhood. I did not know then that I would be an academic, and certainly not the fact that I would work on the question of Islam and women and what that means for South Asia. So as I was rereading some of her work in preparation for today's lecture, it really, I had lots of wonderful flashbacks, and I felt very honored to have been invited to deliver the inaugural lecture. So thank you again to the foundation and for all of you, for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, distinguished guests, Honorable Chief Justice, thank you for coming today to hear this lecture. Some rumination, some scattered thoughts, I hope to piece together on the topics of identity, politics, and inclusion. These are important concepts on their own right, but together have a particular resonance in history, as well as in the current moment in Bangladesh. Before I delve into my lecture, I would like to situate the significance of these concepts in the life and work of late Dr. Sufia Ahmed, in whose memory today's lecture is dedicated. The late Dr. Sufia Ahmed needs no introduction. Daughter of Justice Ibrahim Ahmed, Sufia Ahmed was inspired by her progressive father to love and respect the mother tongue and support the language movement. She was a college student in 1948 when Jinnah declared Urdu as the sole language of Pakistan. In 1952, as a student of Dhaka University, she was amongst those female forerunners to break Section 144 and deny the curfew in Dhaka University campus on February 21st. She survived police brutality and continued to stand against West Pakistani cultural suppression of the Bengali people. By 1960, she had received her doctorate in history from the University of London, returning to Dhaka University to establish herself as an eminent academic and historian. She served as president of the Bangladesh Itihash Porishod, was selected as the first female national professor in 1995, and earned the Ekushe Padok in 2002. Professor Sufia Ahmed's life is one of initiative and leadership. She's amongst the list of luminaries whose dedication and life work can dare to render history, which is mostly marked by his stories, one that is equally about her stories. Professor Ahmed's life is one that brings to the fore an identity as a female, as a patriot, and one that aspires to a new politics for self, community, and nation. In her life, we find a nucleus of gender and cultural inclusion in the quest for dignity and sovereignty, in an era of turbulent politics that can help us think about the contents and contours of national aspirations today. Her work remains as a testimony to the historical significance of these concepts. In Muslim community in Bengal, 1884 to 1912, she discusses the status and challenges to education for the Muslims of colonial Bengal, by highlighting their economic and social condition and the associations by which their educational status received encouragement, forming the foundations of political consciousness and grouping. The book demonstrates both structural constraints as well as the agency and initiative, even if lagging behind their Hindu counterparts, of Bengali Muslims to come into education and enter with the civilizational parameters that had been set by the British. It was within these parameters that the field of resistance and acceptance emerged to shape the future of post-colonial nationhood. The post-colonial questions were not posed and answered around geography and territory only, but through real attachments of belonging, solidarity, and experiences of selfhood and otherness. The colonial field that had set the standards, notably through education and language, held within its boundaries multiple discourses on how to express one's agency and pathways to materialize sovereignty. These multiple ideas, born within the colonial field, have overlaps as well as dissimilarities. Multiple actors, multiple ideas of self, other, and collective sovereignty thus dictated post-colonial outcomes and a sense of creating and belonging through the evolution that has led us to where we find ourselves today in Bangladesh. In today's Bangladesh, we hear resonances of these histories. For the purposes of today's talk, some of the issues that I wish to highlight about the current times are the issues of selfhood and othering, inclusion and exclusion, and the cultural and political contours of these debates. As a nation where the majority are Muslims, are we a Muslim nation? What does that mean? Are we a plural nation with a Muslim personality? What are the implications of that? Are we a secular nation? Should we be? Is secularism a useful construct for a nation of majority Muslims? Let me begin with the Bengali Muslim question first. The Bengali Muslim, beyond the paradox. The historical debate of which part of the Bengali Muslim identity, dyad, takes precedence is a conversation of power. To determine and dominate, where the assertion on either side leads to particular ideals anchoring them in the nation's cultural personality. I agree with the scholarship that argues that the Bengali Muslim nexus is rooted in a long and complex history of territory, conquer, conversion, and co-creation. Muslims have been in Bengal since the 13th century. The advent of Muslims in the Delta, just like any conquest anywhere, was the story of a Muslim conquering class who were Turco-Afghans in ethnicity and Arabic and Persian in tongue. They conquered the locally ethnic Bengali inhabitants, not necessarily by force, as the religion of invaders, as argued by Richard Eaton in his epic account, The Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier, but rather through a rootedness in agricultural expansion. Having found a culturally localized place in Bengal as what Joya Chatterjee has called a civilization-building ideology, or a religion of the plough, Islam's strength lay in its capacity for cultural and economic absorption and the malleability it showed while interacting with indigenous, non-Muslim cultures and lifeways. Some examples include the localization of Islamic figures and superhuman agencies granted to agricultural contexts and priorities by which Islam had become established as profoundly and authentically Bengali. Such localization was not, however, free of religious specialists and personnel whose job was to provide the religious ethos or action that would catalyze forest clearing and agricultural settlements. In fact, Islam's religious gentry, which included petty mullahs, pilgrims returned from Mecca, preachers and holy men, peers, established mosques and shrines which exerted considerable cultural influence and attracted followers and laborers for the clearing and cultivation of rice fields. These activities were supported by the Central Mughal administration through grants. Thus, religious oversight, combined with grants that attracted locals towards agriculture, where the latter's beliefs and symbols remained templates on which Islam would imprint itself, constituted the pathways of Islam's localization in Bengal. It is this synthesis or syncretism that is considered to be the hallmark of Bengali Islam. From an anthropological perspective, such history, mechanics, and spread foretell the story of a rich little tradition compared to big tradition, an educated scholarly tradition. Little traditions are lived traditions. Little tradition of Islam that is localized, woven into the cultural fabric and economic priorities. Bengali Islam is thus one that began as pliable, adaptable, and accommodating. Virtues achieved by religious specialists being open to culture and productivity. It is argued that their theological position had a mystical bent, adopted and deployed in devotion and ritual practices that centered around pirs and shrines. As a result, a non-threatening social milieu was created where Islam was generative, protecting rather than displacing diverse lifeways within communities. The way in which we think of the Bengali Muslim identity as a blend of an ethno-linguistic and ethno-religious one today, the way we think of it today, was not quite what the Bengali Muslim was back then. These identity formations as discrete and political require the framework of nation states, colonial or post-colonial, to galvanize and evolve into ones that demand rights based on distinct sense of self and other. Thus, it is during the colonial era, through the mechanics of modern nation-making, such as the advent of print media, that a certain Bengali Muslim political consciousness developed. With the advent of print media, the agrarian basis of community life changed. Different kinds of cultural, political, and economic conditions, coupled with the culture of literacy and an immutability of the Word of God, would impact the form and content of Islam too. Thus, through the 18th and 19th centuries, the non-cultivating Ashraf classes would steer the discourse and cultural political place of Islam in Bengal. The social cleavages or class distinctions between the agrarian masses and non-agrarian Ashraf influence the discourses around Islam, identify new objectives, and reorient its goals towards new cultural and political concerns. Colonialism's increasing stronghold led to Islam wanting to leave an address to the political clefts and inequities ushered in by colonial administration, paving the way for many reform movements. Inspired by Shah Waliullah, Haji Shariatullah and the Faraizi movement sought to galvanize Muslim sentiment towards reform in ritual and social life. These reforms pivoted around several axes of social cleavages. First, there was a desire to regain the glory of Mughal times when Muslims ruled India. This ambition was spawned by colonial policies that privileged Hindu landlords whose ascending authority and increasingly tyrannizing Muslim peasants. The Faraiji movement, followed by Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya, both based on a return to the obligatory practices of Faroj, thus sought to return to a pure Islam by ridding it of syncretistic beliefs, symbols, and practices that were key to the success of Islam in Bengal. While there is debate about the Arab origins of the Faraizi movement, the search for economic and political equality did indeed grant the movement a locally grounded appeal. It is, however, alleged that such reform movements took Islam away from its original function of building an agricultural civilization cohesively. These built a new orthodoxy. This proposition, however, must contend with the multiple layers of social and political fissures the movement was trying to address, and that it had both otherworldly as well as this worldly objectives and outcomes. The temporal and the spiritual go hand in hand in how Muslim reform envisioned community and belonging. As Oshim Roy argues, that by ignoring the inseparable nexus between the temporal and the spiritual, the historiography of this era reveals an utter confusion and even insouciance in seeking a clear determination of, rather than making an uncritical assumption about, the salience of Islam in these reform and revival movements. The question of Islam as faith and practice and their doctrinal insistence led to further claims beyond the ritual space. Concepts such as shirk and bid'at were brought into everyday religious parlance as ways to embolden the Muslim subject to be a political subject against oppression. The movement's reformative spirit was equally bolstered by proscriptions that discouraged the giving of donations to Hindu festivals, to be excessively devoted to a pir, and mass ritual observances at shrines. A literal adherence to the word of the Quran, or scriptural normativity, and what they considered to be the correct prophetic practice, set the Muslim consciousness apart in communities where Hindu and Muslims lived together. Hindu and other syncretistic practices were discouraged, with such ideology exerting an influence on local mullahs as well as their lay followers. While some think of the Faraizi movement as the first of its kind to be influenced by the Salafi Wahhabi school of thought, especially given Haji Shariatullah's time spent in Saudi Arabia, the changes that the movement brought were localized as textual Islam created the space for reading and debate on religion. Various activities such as fatwas, bahas, and nasihat namaz, which deployed the Bengali language instead of Urdu, Arabic, and Persian for religious ideas to spread far and wide in the community, allowed for textual Islam to spread on the basis of a Bengali ethno-linguistic grounding. It is notable that the first Quran to be translated in Bengali was by a Brahmo leader, Girish Chandra Sen. His tafsir, along with the translation by the writer, journalist, and theologian Naimuddin Ahmed, opened up the space for religious and scriptural thinking in Bengali. By accepting Bengalis to express theological and ritual concerns, educated Muslims demonstrated a growing association with the language and therefore with Bengali ethnicity. This identification of language was subsumed within religious identity, as the content of the author's writing was about being Muslim, not about being Bengali. Nevertheless, by virtue of further development of the Bengali language and the creation of a new literary genre in Bengali, a significant cultural production arose that enhanced Bengali, or perhaps more specifically, Bengali Muslim culture. As a change in the mindset of religious authority, coupled with the idea of Muslim political rights and the availability of religious discourse and debates to a wider segment of educated Bengalis proliferated, it did so without completely eroding the shrine-based religious beliefs and practices that were once the hallmark of Islam's entry into Bengal. In fact, the indigenous Islam and the more textually grounded Islam existed through an interaction and mutual adaptation, where both shrine and pir veneration and reformism can conveniently be captured and viewed in their mutual relationship under the label of Bengali Islam. It is important to mention here that within the cultural field, there existed artistic expressions in literature and music that continued to hold up Islam's potential towards multiculturalism and pluralism. The Sufi poetry of Ali Raja from Chittagong, whose work transcended Hindu-Muslim divides, locating unity through mysticism, is a notable example of the syncretism that prevailed at the time. However, it is much later that such poetry came to occupy a place in the classification of literature from Bengal. Such being the place of different kinds of ritual practice and contemplative and expressive worship, Muslim political consciousness evolved to embrace education in the English language, as well as certain ideas of progress, political consciousness, and a burgeoning statehood leading up to a Pakistan desired and won. And I emphasize that for a reason. In the discussions on how to be Bengali and Muslim in a much desired Pakistan, East Bengali thinkers and writers envisioned a nationalism built on a modern interpretation of Islam and an acknowledgement of Bengal's long history of trans-regional accommodation, as well as highly contingent strategy of playing within the rules of late colonialism. As shown by writers and activists such as Syed Amir Ali and Nawab Abdul Latif, envisioning a dynamic Islam exemplified through principles of movement and ijtihad, Bengali Muslim political consciousness foregrounded in Islam a dynamic reading of the Quran and a critical re-evaluation of the Hadith literature in pushing the boundaries of existing dogma, so that redistributive justice remained a priority on the agenda for nation building. Concepts such as rububiyat and hukul ibad were put forth to argue for the rights of citizens as the servants of Allah, such that man's vicegerency rests on his ability to treat all of creation as equally created and equally worthy of all rights. Such theological underpinnings resonated in literary work and experiments too, where their predominant sentiment was that Pakistan would equal a deliverance out of a negative state of ignorance, tyranny, and oppression. For Rububiyat and Hukul Ibad, I am citing from the Creed of Islam by Abu Hashim. In East Pakistan, cultural expressions of modernist Islam made space for a continued push for Bengali cultural identity, not only by the left secular intellectuals, but also by intellectuals and thinkers of an Islamic ilk. For example, Abu Hashim, even while appointed by Ayub Khan as the director of the Islamic Academy, openly condemned the Pakistani administration's efforts at writing Bengali in the Urdu script. He was equally critical of bans imposed on the music and other work of Rabindranath Tagore, while embracing Tagore's work with pride as products representing humanism within the Bengali language and heritage. Hashim asserted that people of East Pakistan must also cultivate expressions and vehicles of culture that rendered Bengaliness an ongoing project to continue to critically reflect upon. As East Pakistan seceded and Bangladesh was born, modernist readings of Islam were dealt blows at the level of politics, at the level of the politics of nation-making, which overshadowed, even halted cultural experimentation and religious rethinking. Thus, in addition to resistance by the traditional clergy on methodological and philosophical grounds, the proponents of modernist Islam were not on the right side of the politics that was leading the movement and war for independence. Many of the modernists had their roots in the political and literary movements of several decades earlier, were once or continued to be invested in Muslim League politics, and last but not least, did not agree with the geopolitical alignments around the war of 1971. Thus, for a variety of reasons, modernist Islam died a certain death in the nation-making project with the independence of Bangladesh. In independent Bangladesh, the Bengali identity as a cultural category was thus bereft of the intellectual movement and dynamism and peasant mobilization by figures such as Maulana Bhashani that was brought to the framing of Islam earlier. The undisputed supremacy of the Bengali identity, coupled with a ban on religion in public and political life post-1971, left questions about the Islamic in the Bengali Muslim identity unstated and open. For many, this situation reeked of an overt reliance on an Indian Bengali Hindu identity, brought on by India's role in the liberation of Bangladesh and the Awami League's close ties to the Indian government. The boundary blurring of the identities of the two Bengals was read by many as an obfuscation of the reality of Hindu-Muslim divide in pre-partition days, as well as the struggles and experiences of marginalization of the Bengali Muslim in the colonial era. The rest of the story in independent Bangladesh is a long one that all of us present in this room have possibly lived through. Some distinguishing features that frame and shape the contours of the Bengali Muslim identity are debates around secularism, debates around ethnicity versus nationalism, debates around state religion, the political economy of the education sector, the madrasa world and its dispensation, the advent and spread of transnational religious groups, notably Islamic ones, and more recently some Hindu ones too, piety movements, state surveillance and regulation around religion, migration, and last but not least, social and economic mobility. With all of these things unfolding and creating the present social and political field, the Bengali Muslim remains anything but a homogeneous entity. To what extent it is a capacious one. What kinds of changes can it envision and absorb, and the limits on self and society it seeks to impose are important questions that we see posed anew in the making of society and nation today. Inclusion is an important question, and amidst the hope that marks the aftermath of the July Revolution, the indication of social trends towards the capacity of inclusion of the Bengali Muslim constitutes some debate and even controversy. The first vexed issue is the place of other religions, especially the Hindus, and the second one is the question of women in particular and gender diversity in general. Both topics have a history laced with struggles, progress, challenged and illuminated by politics, and manipulated by political actors for their own agenda. I do not wish for this discussion to land us in polemics and nationalist assertions. Perhaps there is a space for both polemics and nationalist assertions, and they serve certain ideological purposes. But what I'm more interested in is an assessment of the ground realities, and as an anthropologist, I remain loyal to the project of hearing the voices on the ground, which are complex. It is for us to tease out from this complexity a range of occurrences and challenges that we as a nation may continue to work towards. Thus, I would like to move past a dichotomy of assertions that Bangladesh is indeed pluralistic and tolerant, and that it is in our DNA as a nation to be so. As the discussion of history has illuminated, what has delivered us to the present times are a range of factors and their complex interworking, whereby religious interpretive frameworks, the contexts that privileged them, the actions they deemed appropriate, their interaction with social and political goals have allowed for a balancing of inclusion and marginalization, with the scales not always equally balanced. The Global Peace Index in 2023 gave Bangladesh a moderate ranking, placing it at number 97 out of 163 countries. In that year, Bangladesh was the most peaceful country in South Asia. That should be noted. Keeping this in mind, I wish to thus not yield to panic and hopelessness either, that Bangladesh has been or may become a land where heterogeneity of experiences and expressions holds no value. After all, we have many examples of communities coming together to help each other, partake in each other's festivities, the birth and existence of mystic movements of the Bawal community, all of which lend credibility to the assertion that the various parts of our society can indeed get along. What I would like to draw attention to is the importance of having frameworks that ensure that the balance between support and the lack thereof, between cooperation and hostility, between animosity and celebration are maintained. I would like to take the remainder of the talk to assess secularism with its promise and challenges as a framework that tackles the question of inclusion. The story of political secularism, as enshrined in the Constitution in 1972, was written to grant Bangladesh a new political framework and cultural ethos. Both its politics and cultural emotions were to mark a new trajectory distinct from its experiences of marginalization in East Pakistan, and prior to that, the communalism of pre- and post-partition India. A further raison d'etre of Bangladesh's secular stance derived from the role of a militant and militarized Islam, playing an active role in the propaganda and real action against the independence movement. The Jamaat-e-Islami had joined hands with the Pakistani state earlier in the 1950s and 1960s to Islamize East Pakistanis and the Bengalis through certain bans and forcible measures against Bengali language and culture. Finally, when the war broke out, they were complicit in carrying out a genocide and war crimes with the Pakistani junta. The various violent and oppressive expressions of religion in politics and the need to transcend such meanings and applications of religion in the public space thus rendered secularism in statecraft and nation building an imperative right from the beginning. In statecraft, secularism was aspired to through a ban of all religious parties from politics. The absence of religion from politics did not mean an emptying out of religion from public expressions. Rather, the constitutional mention of dharma nirapeksha, which translates as religious neutrality, was intended to signal the state's neutrality vis-à-vis religions and religious attachments, without denying any group their own affinities. The Constitution secured a range of fundamental rights, ensuring the full exercise of the rights of religion, life, personal liberty, and security with equal protection from the law. Advocates of such a view argued that secularism should be seen neither as irreverence towards religion, nor as the absence of personal faith, and that to invest or divest personal faith from secularism is to misjudge its place and relevance in the polity. To that effect, constitutional debates on secularism had privileged Bengaliness as the anchor for secularism and grounding force of a Bangladeshi national identity over any cultural, ethnic, or religious ethos. The consensus around Bengaliness as the vehicle of the secular presupposes the absence of other ethnic identities worthy of consideration. Constitutional debates show that the Muslim question was neither debated in 1972 nor refuted. Rather, an inchoate sense of Muslimness was alluded to, where anything from the puritanical Islam of the Wahhabi Faraizi movement to the syncretism of the Baul traditions were invoked to give Muslimness and Bengaliness a certain grounding within the secular and national psyche. The focus on a Bengali identity as the anchor of secularism, rooted primarily in the experience of discrimination and marginalization by West Pakistani authorities, therefore has a certain political and philosophical history and rooting. One such root is that planted by Bengali intellectuals who fell back on predominantly Western modernist thought that privileged progressive and socialist ideas of freedom, along with the humanism of Bengali literature, Rabindranath Tagore. Another root lay in the political mobilization of Maulana Bhashani, a political leader who spoke for peasant rights in East Pakistan, who too advocated for democracy, freedom, and socialism as delivering equality for all people, but did so grounded in Islamic spirituality and a critique of clergy who remain theologically bounded at the expense of understanding how the value in religion lies in its service to the improvement of the material conditions of humans. It must be stated that both these strands that laid the foundations for the Bengali identity as a frame for secularism had, however, embraced Pakistan and a Pakistani identity born out of an experience of marginalization and the need for Muslims to have their homeland. Many of the members from both strands also had strong allegiances to the Muslim League, the party that fought for and won a separate homeland as British India was partitioned. They did not see this in contradistinction from their Bengali identity, nor the need to overemphasize their Muslimness. In fact, once a separate nation state was won for them as Muslims, they focused on bringing into fuller focus the Bengaliness that was the accompaniment of their Muslim and Pakistani identities. Many felt that such important grounding did not have enough of a real reflection in independent Bangladesh. In their place, at the anchoring in culture and literature shared with West Bengal rendered Bangladeshi secularism one that tilted towards our Hindu ethnic fellows across the border. Many allege today that Bangladesh copied India in adopting secularism, whereas India adopted secularism officially after Bangladesh. Perhaps one other way to think about the secular stance of post-colonial countries is through geopolitical affinities of the Cold War era. A certain socialist alignment may have been an additional factor that led to various countries' stated secular objectives. That being said, against the critique and objections, what could be done to make secularism feel better rooted, better grounded, to express the pulse and ethos of the people? The government sought some correctives and made gestures signaling its equidistance from all religions. Some of the gestures included all television broadcasts commencing with recitations from the Quran, Gita, Bible, and Tripitaka. The state also intervened in the erection and governance of religious institutions. Measures included the relaunching of the Islamic Foundation, which Ayub Khan founded as the Islamic Academy in 1961 for a study of Islam and its relevance for a modernizing nation. These overtures notwithstanding, the expected deliverance from the constitutional mandate of secularism was eclipsed by Mujivism, a Kemalist project, many alleged, whose rhetorical value was undermined by a certain authoritarianism that failed to deliver on the promise of prosperity and good governance. it seems that secularism had lost ground in the face of a democratic deficit. In 1971, with the assassination of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the end of the Awami League rule, the constitution and its value and definition of secularism have seen several iterations. The post-1975 era, when the word secularism was pulled out of the constitution and Islam was made state religion, the prime modality of secularization, of separating religion from politics, was reversed, and Islam, as the majority religion, gained grounds in several ways. Under General Zia Rahman's BNP rule, Islamic social and political forces galvanized in both formal politics and the education sector. Groups like Jamaat-e-Islami got busy rebuilding its organization based on core Islamic teachings by focusing on youth circles, mosque councils, and religiously based cultural associations, social welfare groups, and educational institutions to reorient the Bengali Muslim identity towards its Islamic heritage. They engaged in missionary activities as well as mainstream political contestations and protests. By the end of the late 1980s, Jamaat-e-Islami emerged as a visible pro-democracy actor, protesting alongside the centrist BNP and the left-of-center Awami League to overthrow the military dictator General Ershad, eventually becoming an important ally of the BNP from 2001 to 2006. During this period, they put their energies into setting up groups and associations for the male and female youth and proselytizing with the intent of building a critical mass who would eventually vote in an Islamic state. In terms of electoral success, they managed up to 8.6%, I think, of the vote, with only 3 seats in parliament. However, they did have 2 ministers in cabinet, thereby gaining both political visibility and prominence. The rise of the Islamist force, just as a near concurrent rise of the BJP in India, should also be considered in light of the economic conditions and priorities set by the nation. What kinds of economic goals allow and foreclose possibilities of politics and religion's place in it? Is a neoliberal order conducive to religious politics whose vision of redistributive justice and equality is a competitive and combative one? Must it necessarily be so? Beyond a blame game and questioning of political will, these are important bases to assess as we think of questions of identity and its religio-political mobilization. In the post-1975 era, other Islamic voices, notably madrasa teachers and representatives, were also emboldened by the state through the formalization of Aliyah madrasas. This gave the ulema a solid seat to be publicly engaged, leading to the creation of a new cadre of religious subjects who espoused both secular and religious knowledge. The Aliyah madrasas had a competitor in the Qaumi of Deobandi ancestry that remained outside the purview of the state, yet continuing to draw in a much larger student pool who would partake in a more rigorous religious foundational training than that offered by the Aliyah madrasas. As a race to religious authority ensued between the 2 kinds of madrasas, they rose to heightened prominence through political mobilization. The Aliyah madrasas became the magnets for the Jamaat-e-Islami, and the Qaumi madrasas launched their own political parties, even floating a presidential candidate, Hafizi Hutu, in the early 1980s. The Qaumi platform, in spite of staying out of state regulation, yielded their influence through their political platforms and through the classical training in Islamic studies. Their support of and participation in tabligh activities of preaching, their learned art of giving khutbahs, as well as that of discussion and debates towards interreligious debates.
they secured for themselves a position of religious authority that is unmatched by their Aliyah counterparts. The confluence of various Islamic actors in the public space has paved the way for alliances, sometimes political, at other times ideological. The ideological space of convergence have not been very different from Jamaat-e-Islami's anti-Western cultural globalization, where collective objections have galvanized around local issues ranging from freedom of expression, such as in the Taslima Nasreen case, we saw that, anti-NGO protests, denouncing government policy around women and education, and supporting the persecution of free thinkers and writers, differently believing or atheists. The allegations against the staunch secular posturing of the Mujib era that kept religion out of politics were thus redressed, and Bangladeshi nationalism was one that gestured towards allowing a more inclusive religious basis of the nation, one that should have placated the demands to be less partially represented. However, other worries that such inclusion could also be corrosive of larger ideals of inclusion and pluralism worried many. I feel that a missing space left by thinkers and politicians such as Abul Hashim and Maulana Bhashani, a space that was left open on the eve of independence, should also have had some interested contenders. That being said, what should be the role, framework, and limits of inclusion, and does secularism have anything to do with it, are questions that came up by the end of 2006. In 2012, the Awami League reinstated the word secularism in the constitution and had heavily clamped down on radicalism. However, Islam remained the state religion, and the forces in politics and education that spread from 1975 onwards remained active and thriving. The Islamist camp, however, did not think this sufficed, especially after the Awami League government tried and hanged several Jamaat-e-Islami leaders for war crimes committed in 1971. Through the International Crimes Tribunal set up domestically in 2009. The tribunal faced procedural questions, and almost 15 years later, with the ousting of Sheikh Hasina, the irregularities, legal as well as administrative, that put certain Islamic quarters away have given secularism a bad name. Allegations of persecution, torture, disappearance, along with the ability to be Islamic through education opportunities, avenues to practice religion on their own terms and dress as they like, were seriously restrained by the secular mandate, which in reality countered and criminalized political opposition. In doing so, it is now alleged that secularism was a tool to uphold Islamophobia. While many wonder what Islamophobia means in a Muslim-majority country, where Islam is the state religion, the Islamic camp argues that the regime's complicity with the global campaign and war on terror, including its proximity to India, where the BJP's overtly Hindu majoritarian stance marginalizes Muslims, along with the deep suspicion that the Jamaat-e-Islami and other Islamist forces can never support a progressive growth for Bangladesh, renders a secular project one that is indeed Islamophobic. Critics argue that. Mutual suspicion is not necessarily a bad thing. Legal anthropological work in Egypt by University of Chicago professor Hossein Ali Agrama argues that suspicion is potentially a generative feature that keeps secularism not a finite project, but one that is evolving in a dynamic conversation whereby all parties compete to do better. What does it mean to do better is the question. But this competition has to be won for the better and towards change that helps and opens up possibilities for people's lives. In the face of corrupted power and disregard for procedures of the rule of law, suspicion may yield destructive tendencies instead of a generative balancing act. In the case of Bangladesh, the political field's management of suspicion in the presence of other vices is indeed problematic. However, as Masha Schulz argues, secularism's place in Bangladesh is dispersed beyond party politics, vote bank considerations, and other priorities. Here, what is argued as secular and what is not are contingent upon how power is garnered by different actors where social factors, personal emotions, convictions, and sensibilities influence decisions about the secular and thereby about religion. I draw your attention to the garnering of power and the spaces with potential to yield and not shut down ever-growing, ever-evolving new spaces. It is these that define secularism, its potential and challenges. The kinds of conversations that are ongoing at the moment of better management of power, to have opened multiple spaces from which power emanates, so that each quarter competes and does better, are thus very much secular questions and demands, not only because they are this worldly, but because they are about constant growth, constant expansion for the collective good. It is these conceptual parameters of change, growth, and through it, collective flourishing that should guide the direction the country might take. And to deliberate on the common good is what should secure secularism. In other words, if we want democracy, that itself must lead from a secular process. Before I conclude, I would like to draw your attention to the relationship between secularism and another important inclusion, that of women and questions of gender equality, highlighting why and how secular assumptions and advocacy have been crucial to initiatives on women's progress. A woman's agenda has historically been a secular one. This secularity is premised on a few things that had to be done to give women the voice and means to challenge the conditions of their own oppression. First of all, in the colonial times, the work of vanguards of the women's movement, writers and activists such as Begum Rokeya, questioned the cultural customs of segregation that had religious interpretation and approval intertwined with them. In a dictatorial Pakistan, legal rights through the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance of 1961 were secured also by challenging traditional religious interpretations and bringing to the fore modernist notions of Islam as propagated by the theologian Fazlur Rahman and his followers. Thus, women's groups have positioned themselves as secular forces due to their anchoring of change in a critique of societal structures, along with religious ones if they seek to surveil and hold back women's voices. This work and the attempts to change women's lives by challenging societal structures has received backlash, especially when familial relationships were restructured. In a newly independent Bangladesh, women's groups consisting of feminist and women's rights organizations have left footprints in a variety of arenas with many strides in women's progress, all the while maintaining an arm's length from not only conservative but all forms of religion. Some notable examples of women's group resisting have been around the issue of fatwas in village councils in which religion and male religious authority were deeply implicated. Women's groups have also pressed for reforms in family laws, which have raised the ire of religious groups. The Jamaat-e-Islami in 2008 and 2010, and then the Hifazat in 2013, have led large-scale mobilization against the National Women's Development Policy that mentions that women should be able to control their acquired assets. Religious groups read this to mean that the policy advocates equal inheritance for men and women, which they vehemently oppose on the grounds that it goes against the Sharia. Examples of social development initiatives show that village men complain of income opportunities for women through gender quotas in local government and for school teachers, along with tougher laws on violence against women. Thus, men and certain religious forces are joined in their allowance of opportunities for women that serve their families and larger community, but stand in joint opposition to initiatives that challenge male patriarchal power. For these reasons, women's groups have long stood on the side of secularism, even taking to street protest in the 1980s when Ershad removed the term from the Constitution. Women's groups whose work is to allow women's voices to be heard through the multiple layers of power that shroud them, and to create pathways of flourishing in the face of cultural religious forces that have different visions of women's and societal flourishing, have had no other recourse but to anchor their work in a space that is free of religious imposition. Critics have called this space partial too, that its liberalism is imported, that its anchoring in secular laws overrides other laws, and that in other worldviews, women also have a dignified and respectful standing, which the secular worldview of women's rights advocates does not acknowledge. Is the mutual suspicion of the two camps generative? Can it be generative and remain true to women's experiences of marginalization? Is there something to be done to bridge the worldview and aspirations? First of all, women's voices are those that matter. That has to be agreed on. It is they who must fix the limits of what allows them to thrive. If, in the process, religious norms are challenged, we should allow women to shed light on that too, to see the extent to which they wish to navigate the religious terrain. A navigation of the religious terrain will allow women to be spokespersons of religion as well, giving rise perhaps even to a female clergy. I'm thinking of utopia. But there are examples and precedents in both Morocco and Indonesia. And what would then be the secular order of state and society? Ideally, a recasting of secularism would occur to allow the voices of different kinds of women, of different classes, ethnicities, religious preferences, to carve out women-friendly pathways and policies. This secularism would be an accommodating one, a soft stance one, which sees no problem with religion in the private or public sphere. But the space should remain one that is open, free of fixed ideas about women, and one that can confront a range of powers, including those that deploy religion against women's flourishing. To conclude, the current discontent with the secular is based on some valid critique. The allegations that it was born elsewhere, in Europe, that in Europe its dispensation privileges a majoritarian Christian ethos, are not unfounded. The local allegations that secularism has been deployed and abused in the service of authoritarian power is also true. Hence the appeal that